thank you to the Melbourne Georgian Choir under the leadership of Nino Tsitsishvili and co-conductor Joseph Giordania. Thank you for the slow, majestic East Georgian blessing song, Mravaljaimia. Many happy returns. May God wish you a long life. Rita Machulaitine, the president of the Australian Melbourne Lithuanian Bendruomenė. New president, congratulations.
Thank you, choir. You were amazing. Sveiki atvykę. On behalf of the Lithuanian community in Melbourne, I welcome you all to this special book launch. To present her latest work, may I introduce to you the author and the very talented Dr. Grazina Pranauskas. Grazina.
Labai diena visiems ir labai atsiprašau, kad šiandien aš kalbėsiu angliškai dėl dviejų priežasčių. Mano knyga yra parašyta anglų kalba ir šiandien turime nepaprastai daug svečių, kurie nesupranta lietuviškai. Bet žinodama tai iš anksto, aprašiau savo knygą abiejose laikraščiuose, Mūsų pastogė ir Tėviškės aidai. Ir jeigu ko nors šiandien nesuprasit, nes aš vis tiek kalbu su akcentu, nors ir daug metų čia gyvenu, pasiskaitysite namuose. Atsiprašau. I just said sorry to everyone that I would be speaking in English for two reasons. One, because my book is written in English, and two, we have important guests and lovely guests and singers who don't understand Lithuanian. So it would be a disservice for me to speak my own language, although I would love to, because I am not proficient in English, and when I came to Australia, I couldn't speak a word English, so I'm sorry. But now, it is my great pleasure to introduce my first guest, Professor Mark Edel, from the University of Melbourne. Mark is a historian of the Soviet Union and its successor states, in particular Russia. He is the inaugural Hansen Chair in History, as well as an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, and is only one of 4 people in Australia who specializes in the history of the Soviet Union. My applause to Mark.
Thank you. My brief is to give you the historical background to this collection of short stories, and I feel a little bit silly to do that here, to talk about the history of Lithuania, given that you probably all know it better than I do. I'll just give you a short, very quick run through where this book is located, both in the history of Lithuania and in the history of the Soviet Union, where these stories are taking place. Lithuania came into the Russian Empire in 1795 when the Grand Duchy was taken apart by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and it remained under the Russian Empire until World War I. There were several uprisings, and there was a growing national movement in the 19th century, but it was really only with World War I and the breakdown then of the empire that Lithuania re-emerged as an independent state. It's occupied in 1915 by Germany. It becomes part of Ober-Ost, and it remains there until the Germans retreat. So then we get the story of what is usually told in the Western world as the Russian Civil War, which in reality is a multiplicity of civil wars, and revolutions, which are better understood probably as the wars of succession of the Romanov Empire. And out of it, several states emerge, independent states, the largest, of course, the Soviet Union, but also Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and Finland. The Vilnius region remains with Poland in the interwar years, which had occupied it during this period of multiple wars. Lithuania emerges as a constitutional democracy, but that does not last very long. Like other countries in the region, it reverts to an authoritarian system in 1926. But one has to say that these authoritarianisms are quite different from the kind of fascist dictatorships you have in Germany or in Italy. Much weaker forms of dictatorship in many ways. And the big moment, of course, in this history then, which comes in the book again and again, is 23rd August 1939, Hitler-Stalin Pact or Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Lithuania originally gets into the German sphere of influence, but that is eventually renegotiated and it reverts to the Soviet sphere. The Soviets negotiate or pressure Lithuania into accepting military bases in October 1939, and as part of the deal they hand over Vilnius and the Vilnius region, which they had just taken from Poland just before, right, in September, after they go in from the east after the Germans had attacked Poland. And then on 14th June 1940, there's a Soviet ultimatum to which the government eventually buckles, and Soviet troops come into the country, and the country is annexed. It becomes a Soviet republic in July 1940, and that first Soviet occupation is extremely traumatic. There are some 12, and that's less than a year, right? This first occupation. But there's some 12,000 arrests and 17,000 deportations. Then the Germans attack. There's an uprising against the Soviets, which does not lead to an independent state because the Germans basically don't let it happen. Becomes part of the Reichskommissariat Ostland. For most Lithuanians, this is a less brutal occupation than the Soviet one before or after, with the major exception of the Jews. The Jews, Lithuania's Jews, are basically exterminated during German occupation. Very few survive. That is also something which comes up in these stories. Soviets reoccupy in 1944. That before they come, there's a mass exodus from Lithuania to leave, and many of the Australian Lithuanian community, of course, have a part of that exodus, that flight from the Soviets. There's long-lasting guerrilla warfare and resistance against Soviet occupation, which also comes up in the book, in particular, then also the mass arrests and deportations. Again, the largest in 1949, which more or less ends the organized resistance. There's some happening thereafter, but that's an end point. That was 69,000 people deported in 1949. Overall, during the last years of Stalin's rule, between 1945 and 1953, there were some 118,000 deportations and some 181,000 arrests. So deportations are people who are not actually accused of having done anything. They're just removed because they're assumed to be potential enemies. And there's nearly 800 death sentences between 1945 and 1947, when the death sentence is abolished temporarily in the Soviet Union. After Stalin's death, and this is where the short stories are located, there is an easing of the regime and a beginning accommodation of many with the post-Stalin Soviet regime, but there's also a growing dissident movement in the 60s and 70s against Soviet occupation. Most of the stories are located in the late 70s and early 80s. Some of them are under Gorbachev, but most of them are located in what is known as the period of stagnation, where the economy has slowed to a snail's pace, and where the accommodation between the regime and the Soviet population is summarized in the witticism, you pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. During the Soviet occupation, the Baltic states are sort of a window to the west. That's where Russians go to see how good life is like. This is where the fashion industry of the Soviet Union is located. This also plays a role in several of the stories. Fashion come up again and again. And I just realized that it just so happens that the jacket I'm wearing today I bought in Vilnius earlier this year. Under Gorbachev, then, there's a growing national movement which can become more and more open. And an important moment is the 23rd of August, 1989, on the 50th anniversary of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. We have the so-called Baltic Way, which is a 600-kilometer-long human chain from Vilnius, Riga to Tallinn. And that also plays a role in at least one of the stories, two, I think, if I remember well. And Lithuania is then the first of the Soviet republics which declares independence on 11th March 1990, and since 2004 it's part of NATO and EU. The only other thing I want to just quickly mention before I hand over to the next person who will actually talk about the book itself is that the other thing that's going on, and that comes up in many of the stories, is the Afghanistan war since 79 until 89. So that comes up in several stories as well as a background of men disappearing and so on. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I would not be a writer as I am today if I didn't have supervisors Enzo Gandolfo and Karina Smith. They are here today to test my knowledge and to see how far I've gone since 2015 when I finished my studies. And I can tell you, they changed my life. In 7.5 years, I studied part-time. These two ladies made me realize that writing is all about history. And that's why these people are here, to set the history stage for us to understand why my characters acting as they do. But more about it. I'd like to invite my second guest today is my PhD principal supervisor, Enzo Gandolfo. Enzo is a fiction writer and an honorary professor in creative writing at Victoria University. She is shortlisted for 2019 Stellar Prize for her novel, The Bridge.
So I'm honoured to be here to help launch Grazina's wonderful collection of short stories, Soviet Fairytales. And as Grazina said, we first met in 2007 when she contacted me to discuss doing a PhD in creative writing. She enrolled in 2008, and along with Karina Smith, we met regularly over the next 7 years as Grazina worked on her PhD part-time while holding down a full-time job first at BU and later at Melbourne University. From the very beginning, I was impressed by her passion and her commitment to write about the experiences of the Lithuanian community in Australia. One of the reasons I love supervising PhDs is because I learn so much from my students, none more so than Grazina. Her research for her novel and for the exegesis was extensive. She worked hard and long, committed to producing the best work she could, to tell the story in fiction and in theory that would capture the experiences for her community. She says that we made her a writer, but I think she made herself a writer. I've never had a student who worked so hard. In her exegesis, Grazina wrote, "Living in Lithuania from 1957 to 1989, but not knowing my country's history, I was deprived of understanding the significance of historical and political events. 1 month before I left Lithuania for Australia, I remember making jam from berries collected in the forest close to my home. My girlfriend came around to invite me to the beach, just 15 minutes walk from my flat, to participate in the Baltic Way celebration, which we just heard mentioned. It was the 23rd of August 1989, and I said, I'm not interested in politics. I'm much happier making jams than holding hands with strangers for no reason. We both laughed and she went alone. Even now thinking about that particular day makes me sad. I didn't realise the significance of the Baltic Way celebration, which symbolised the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the Soviet Nazi plot to take over Europe. And I didn't even get to eat the jam I made that day, because a month later I left Lithuania and on the 22nd of September I landed in Melbourne. More than 25 years have passed, and my regret at not being part of the Baltic Way has increased in Australia over time. My desire to learn more about Lithuanian history has also grown. I began to increase my knowledge of Lithuanian history through conversations with post-war generation Lithuanians, as well as through borrowing books from the Lithuanian libraries and archives in Australia. In the 1990s, after Lithuania became independent from the Soviet Union, I discovered more of my country's history, realising that there are different interpretations of the same events, which impact on post-war Soviet and post-Soviet Lithuanians' sense of belonging in Australia. It is Grazina's knowledge of Lithuanian history and politics, alongside her personal experience of living in Lithuania, of living behind the Iron Curtain for the first 32 years of her life, that makes this collection so rich and so poignant. These stories are written from an insider perspective. This is a world that Grazina knows well, deeply, that she has experienced, that is embedded in her skin, in her heart, and in her memories. It is a testament to her skills as a writer that she's been able to take these experiences and the knowledge that she's gained through her research and create characters who have their own stories to tell. Stories that allow us, the readers, to experience the world from the point of view of those characters, to walk around in their shoes. The stories in Soviet fairy tales are powerful and engaging. They are sometimes sad, sometimes humorous, often dark and confronting, because at the centre of them are real characters whose desires and passion we can all relate to. These are ordinary men and women who want to find love, to travel, to work, to be free, to live their lives. But their relationships and connections with friends, lovers, colleagues and family members are often impacted on by the secrets they are forced to keep, the lies they feel compelled to tell, and the fear of betrayal that infects even the closest of relationships, even the most joyful occasions. Like in the story Christmas Eve with Friends, where after a lovely night celebrating Christmas, in secret of course, with close friends, Vili worries that she's revealed too much. My face burned thinking about telling others of the forbidden dosha marks safely hidden in my skirt, of freely exchanging Soviet jokes and not complying with the curfew to return to the hotel by 10 p.m. If the KGB had my file, what hope did I have to travel again? Vili's joy and celebration had been so innocent. As a reader, I'd been completely swept up in it. Her regret, her fear, gives us the insight into the world that she's living in, always having to look over her shoulder, always having to be vigilant, careful, not able to trust even those closest to her. Grazina has called this collection Soviet Fairytales. This play with the idea of the fairy tale sets the tone of the collection. Fairy tales are normally stories peopled with magical and imaginary beings, often set in imaginary places, stories meant for children, stories that are a complete fabrication, a lie. But the characters in Soviet fairy tales are not magical beings. They don't inhabit imaginary places. Instead, these are socialist realist stories set in real places tackling real issues. But like all good fairy tales, there are monsters lurking. There are dark and sinister rumblings. And behind the real world is another secret world that doesn't always reveal itself. These fairy tales are both entertaining and challenging. They challenge our ideas and beliefs, our morals and ethics. They force us to think about what is right and wrong and how we might act if we found ourselves in these same situations. Of course, the title Fairy Tales also refers to the promises of communism and the lies told by the Soviet Union and its supporters in communism's name. The characters in Soviet fairy tales have to depend on their own resilience and strength to survive, but survival is not always possible. For example, in Prince Charming, a particularly sad story, two young people who meet and enjoy an evening's entertainment at a cultural centre find themselves reprimanded and sacked from their jobs. This sacking foreshadows the tragedy to come. Ramun finds Vitanis charming, but he's gay and his sexuality will never be accepted. She can't save him. One of my favourite writers, Isabella Allende, wrote, "I feel that writing is an act of hope, a sort of communion with our fellow man. The writer of goodwill carries a lamp to illuminate the dark corners. Only that, nothing more, a tiny beam of light to show how some hidden aspect of reality, to help decipher and understand it, and thus to initiate, if possible, a change in the conscience of the readers." In this collection, Grazina takes us behind the Iron Curtain, illuminates a world that many of us have no understanding of. The stories here cover many significant cultural and political and social events and various aspects of everyday life. Yuri Gagarin's journey into space in 1961, the role of the KGB, attitudes to sexuality and religion, the trauma of deportation and imprisonment, the censorship that kept citizens in the dark about their own history. But this is not a history book, it's not a political diatribe. The focus is on the impact of these circumstances and events on the lives of the characters, the way these characters work with and around the political and social constraints to fulfil their desires and ambitions, to maintain their relationships, to fall in love, to have families. This book makes an important contribution to Australian literature. It will be important for those, who, like Grazina, lived in the Soviet Union through the 60s, 70s and 80s, who will see their lives reflected here, but also for the rest of us who have grown up in the West with very little understanding of what daily life might have been during that period. All writers make choices about the stories they tell. Grazina has chosen to tell the stories of her community. This is important, especially in Australia, where there are still so few books published that explore the experiences of migrants and refugees, both their experiences in Australia and in their native countries. While Australian literature and media remain dominated by stories of the white, Anglo, middle class, we can't hope to grow as a nation. It is easy to judge or dismiss people that we don't understand, whose actions seem incomprehensible, but it's much harder to do that if you've had a chance to get to know them and see the world from their perspective. Through storytelling, we can gain a greater understanding of ourselves and of each other and become, I believe, a more humane and compassionate nation. I'd like to congratulate Grazina on this beautiful and powerful collection. Reading Soviet Fairytales was a very rewarding experience for me, and I warmly recommend it to you all. I'm thrilled to be part of this celebration and to see this book launched into the world.
Now the Melbourne Georgian Choir will perform faster and rhythmical Abkhazian song sung during the traditional ritual horse riding festivities. The song is called Asharatin, has no words and contains nonsense syllables only. Was very nice, wasn't it? Let's clap again. Thank you. Just imagine yourself in the Lithuanian hills and Caucasus Mountains. When I arrived in Australia from Soviet Lithuania 30 years ago today, I discovered a sense of personal freedom that overwhelmed me. As a professional choir conductress, even during informal gatherings, I used to dress up as used to go on stage, ready to perform. And it was extremely difficult to blend into life without those expectations. As Soviet citizens, we were encouraged to attend concerts, movies, and theaters at low cost. Cafes were full of people discussing professional entertainment or the release of a new book. Hundreds of cultural houses were built to encourage local talent and accommodate national song and dance competitions. Intellectual and artistic stimulation was taken for granted. It never occurred to us to question why there were so many cultural institutions. We did not realize that our parents and grandparents had withheld from us that they were built to deter people from going to church and believing in God. The Soviet Union, in which I grew up, stretched from the Baltic and Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean and consisted of 15 Soviet socialist republics. People outside the Soviet Union were not aware of the extent to which ordinary citizens were Sovietized against their will. For those of us who grew up knowing no other system, we experienced the process as normal. During the years of Soviet occupation, we were forced to commemorate the 9th of May Day, marking the Russian victory over Nazi Germany at the end of 1941-45 war. As a student of today's Klaipėda Stasys Šimkus Conservatory of Music, I remember nobody was particularly keen to carry the Russian flag, nor the placards praising the Russian bravery. Diligent students, all we wished was to spend our day catching up with studies, but we were afraid to disobey, as we knew that individual names were ticked off before the march. After Klaipėda, I was a student at the notoriously strict Vilnius Music Conservatory, founded in 1940, today the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre. While perfecting their music skills, students were drowning out the sounds of desperate cries, having no idea that next door, in a KGB building on Gedimino Avenue, people were being tortured, with more than 1,000 people executed there between 1944 and the early 60s. The building continued to function as a Lithuanian headquarters of the KGB until 1991. The realization today that as a student of the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre from 1979 to 1984, I was that close to the center of a Soviet repression stuns me. I was so naive at the time. The stretched out hand of revolutionary leader pointing towards the KGB building had no meaning to me. I had no idea of what the building housed. Born and bred in Lithuania, I was exposed to life behind the Iron Curtain for 32 years. I carried that past with me to Australia. For a long time here, I felt something was missing from my life, until I began working on the stories of Soviet fairy tales. Started in August 2016, the stories have been written over a period of 2 years. From the outset, my aim was to show how ordinary citizens trapped under the banner of Soviet communism, which sought to control every aspect of life, still longed for romantic love, still aspired for meaningful human connection. Music has been a central element of my life for as long as I remember. Having music background helped me to incorporate the names of the instrumental pieces and songs common during the Soviet era. For instance, in One Night in Ossetia, a group of Soviet tourists are climbing a Caucasus mountain. At night, sitting around the fire, they sing a common Russian song in Russian. My address is not a house or a street. My address is Soviet Union. Today, I realized the meaning of the words, which I have never questioned while living in the Soviet Union. The compulsory Russian language and cultural blending made people identify with the whole Soviet Union as their home. The process of blending into a Soviet identity resulted in the government's possession of private land and reorganization of the agricultural sector into collective farming. Stealing government property was a norm. One of my stories revealed the extent of such behavior. The Forger uncovers the level of corruption in the Soviet Union that proudly advertised principles of communist society, quote, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, unquote. By forging documents, the main character Vladas utilizes his ability to work, quote, to the greatest benefit of the people, unquote. While helping members of a corrupt society to build communism, no division between rich and poor, everybody sharing food and private property with each other, the thought that what is yours is mine resulted in people helping themselves at the collective farms. As school children, we also worked there and were encouraged to bring a bag for taking plenty of vegetables home. Imagine us loading collective goods into a bus in full view of government officials. Stealing in the middle of the day was common, and everybody did it to sustain the principle of being like everybody else. Classless society was meant to result in a flawless Soviet citizen, slim, good-looking, strong, healthy, and having the correct sexual orientation. Elements of life that did not conform to the ideal society, such as prostitution or homosexuality, were hidden from the public eye. At school, we had no sex education, nor were we aware of prostitution. My stories, Army and Sex and Prince Charming, shine a light on what happened behind the facade of the ideal Soviet citizen. Army and Sex reveals how a couple accidentally discovers a prostitution ring in a cafe in the old town of Klaipeda, and they call themselves 16th Division, if you know what I mean. They feel uncomfortable observing women chatting with foreign sailors, laughing and touching them each other inappropriately. In Prince Charming, the pleasant small-town man Vitanis is admired by women. His secret of being gay shocks his female colleague Ramune, as she doesn't know what it means. My reader may be wondering why every one of my stories revolves around love and the obstacles to attain it. The reason is simple. There were not enough men in Lithuania. The ratio of some 3 women to 1 man encouraged men's popularity beyond their imagination. The uneven gender distribution was due to many factors: men dying in the Second World War, purges, deportation, exodus, the 1979-89 Afghan war, alcoholism, suicides, serving time in jail, and working at sea for prolonged periods of time. In my class in Kretinga High School, we were 22 girls, while the number of boys was just 9. Given the numbers, attaining love was not easy for a woman who had to avoid getting tangled in a relationship with a divorcee or a womanizer. Some were lucky to find an eligible man. Others, not finding a well-educated match, remained spinsters. And believe me, nearly all my girlfriends are spinsters today. My stories, Back to Herself and The Forger, disclose a young woman's desire to find a suitable partner. And throughout the book, I contrast the romanticized love of my characters with the harsh reality over which they had little control. Overall, my stories capture the 20th century historical and political events that exposed the Lithuanian nation to political repression. Some of my stories open deep personal wounds of forced deportations. Christmas with Friends, set in 1982, starts with celebration of a Christmas Eve, when memories of Lithuania's past creep in through a photo of a deceased husband of a party hostess. Dancing figurines takes the reader from Melbourne to Novosibirsk in the beginning of the 80s, where an Australian woman of Lithuanian descent reunites with her grandmother, an ex-prima ballerina taken from a stage of the Kaunas Opera Theatre in 1944 and deported to Siberia. These and other stories in Soviet fairy tales reveal the suppression of human rights and the desire for personal freedom. The story, I Want to Be Like Simas, is a tribute to a Lithuanian sailor who in 1970 had escaped a Soviet ship in his attempt to defect to the United States Coast Guard in international waters. Simas Kudirkas's desire for personal freedom was shortcut. He was taken back to the Soviet ship, beaten, transported to shore, interrogated, and sentenced to 10 years jail. After serving 4 years in a Soviet prison, Simas and his close family were allowed to migrate to America, as it appeared that his mother was born there. My protagonist, Ginteras, a vice captain of a Soviet fishing trawler, wants to be like Simas. In 1987, he successfully escapes his ship and seeks political asylum in Madrid. Later, resettled in the United States, he meets his idol Simas, whose very look reveals the thoughts of a seaman who has seen it all. With Mikhail Gorbachev's coming to power in March 1985 and introducing the policies of glasnost and perestroika, the Soviet Republic's ties with Moscow began to loosen. In 1990, Lithuania became the first republic to proclaim its independence from the Soviet Union, igniting determination for national freedom amongst the rest of and heralding the final disintegration of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991. My last story, Dreaming of Sweden, shows the extent to which the citizens of the Soviet era had no access to their own country's history. A week before my launch, I wrote to Enza that the process of writing of my Soviet fairy tales took my life away and healed my soul. She was intrigued by this revelation and had hoped I would talk about how it happened. Standing here today, I'm not a person who arrived on the 22nd of September 1989. As a Soviet citizen, I had to gradually reshape my being into my different surroundings. To deal with the shock of changing systems, not returning home after 6 weeks as planned, and remaining in Australia till this very day, encouraged me to keep writing. By popping in and out of my Soviet fairy tale characters, I was able to reimagine what the life of ordinary citizens was like. I surfaced as an actress with a long nose, ballerina deported to Siberia, a librarian daydreaming about her Prince Charming. I stand on a Caucasus mountain, observing the vastness of the Soviet Union. I cry with people holding hands during the Baltic Way, the event that will forever hold its significance. And like my character Gitana in Dreaming of Sweden, wish to escape from behind the Iron Curtain. I hope that my stories will touch your heart because you had experienced exodus, your family members had been deported to Siberia, you lived in the Soviet Union, or because you have opened a new page of knowledge into the communist system that has failed to sustain its significance. And this is where it becomes very interesting. After reading some of my Soviet fairy tales, Dr. Joseph Giordania, lecturer world music, Melbourne Conservatorium of Music, Faculty of Fine Arts and Music, wrote the following praise. As a person from the former USSR, I have read these stories with great interest. Delightful stories, It is amazing to see how profoundly different the life of young people was in the Soviet Union and in the West, and still how profoundly similar were the feelings and aspirations of young people in the East and in the West. Could you please elaborate on your words, Joseph?
I'll be brief. I kind of bring a perspective from Georgia. I'm not Lithuanian. And I can tell you that there was a profound difference, as I've already said, between Soviet life and Western life. But there were also profound differences between different peoples of Soviet country. And I can tell you the difference between Georgia and Lithuania. Or I've traveled quite a lot because I love traveling, and as the Soviet Union was, as we call it, big prison for 250 million people, I've traveled to every republic of Soviet Union. And I remember we were always saying that, well, you could not go to West, but if you want to go to experience the West, you need to go to Baltic countries, because they were closer to the West. And I remember one of my cultural shocks when I arrived to Lithuania, and I found out that they had toilet paper in toilets, in public toilets. So, but if you go beyond that, if you eliminate the difference between Georgia and Lithuania, Georgia became part of Soviet Union from the very beginning, from 1921, after a short independence. And of course, Lithuania, because of that, escaped the horrible years of 1937-38, and hundreds of thousands of Georgians, Russians, and many other peoples who were already in Soviet Union were murdered, including my grandfather, his brothers, his father. So, in a way, today our meeting reminds me the Soviet Union itself. It was a huge country. So to imagine that Lithuania and Georgia and Kazakhstan were all together part of one country, it's quite a miraculous thing. And another element that brings me the memories of Soviet Union is that in Soviet Union, Georgian singing, Georgian polyphonic singing was something like a cultural icon. Because Soviets were always touchy about the Western allegations about not having freedom of speech and freedom of expressing their feelings. And for them, the folk singing, народная песня, it was something that, listen to them, that's what they say, that's what they feel. So for them, beautiful Georgian singing was a kind of a sound coming from Soviet Union, sound that was to symbolize Soviet people's happiness. And of course, no one knew that in many songs, the words were changed. You could not sing a song that mentioned any sense or anything to do with God. So let's forget about that. I want to congratulate Grazina with a wonderful set of stories. And of course, when you read the stories, you read them differently. You are from Lithuania, you are from Georgia, you are from Uzbekistan, you are from Russia, or you are from Western countries. Everyone has their own understanding. So there will be so many emotions connected to this book as people reading them. And it's good to see that there's a Lithuanian society here. There are so many Lithuanians coming here because you were able to immigrate in 1930s, 1940s. Our immigration from Georgia started only after 91. So if you think that there are many Georgians in the Georgian choir, you'll be mistaken. Myself and Nino. That's all the rest they just love Georgian singing. So, Grazina, thank you very much for your wonderful work, and I congratulate. I was very happy to read them. Thank you.
Just a short anecdote to connect us to Georgian beach. As Joseph said, he traveled extensively around the Soviet Union. That's what we all did. We saved all year and then we traveled. We worked in 3 jobs and then we traveled. So we arrived in Tbilisi, to Georgia, and we go to the beach, girls, from all the countries. It's not in my book, this episode, but yes, there were Estonian, there was Latvian, there was someone else from Belarus, and we lying on a beach, and some of us were from Lithuania, and we say, oh, this man is really looking at us. How dare he is, you know, what do you think he is doing here? And he said, Laba diena, mergaites. So he was from Lithuania himself. So just looked a little Georgian, so because his father was Georgian or something. So you have to be careful not to use you didn't know who all these people were. Now I have invited my colleague Liliana Brownberger. She's a service delivery manager at the University of Melbourne, but she's also a filmmaker and actress. And I asked her to read an excerpt from my story, One Night in Ossetia, because as Joseph said, everyone reading it differently. So if I was reading, I know it, so I read differently, but I wanted to see what other people would feel when they read my story. And it's plenty of love, believe me.
My name is Zita from Lithuania, I say, extremely pleased that I'm still wearing my mascara. When I ask for the meaning of his name, he tells me that, according to legend, Atsamaz was a singer, a musician, and the winner of the golden flute. He purposely lowers the corners of his well-shaped lips, expressing his regret at not being able to play any instrument. His deep and pleasant voice takes me to the Caucasus, to the lands that legend had populated with gods and supernatural beings. The Ossetian gods, often identified with Christian saints, gave birth to legends of semi-divine heroes. Atsamaz is convinced that his name has much in common with a so-called hero in the epic Naat. He uses the Abkhazian version of the myth in which Naats, war bandits, fought with local heroes. One of the legends features the 100 sons of the mythological figure Satanaya, the mother of the Naats. I comment that being a bandit is not very nice, and he assures me it wasn't always the case, recounting snippets of the Ossetian myth depicting the Naatic tribe of the bravest Aksetagate clan. I try to repeat the name Aksetagate after him, and he is amused with my Lithuanian pronunciation. He whispers to me that I must keep his stories to myself. There is no room for our ancient myths in the Soviet history, he says. Only now I realise I don't know any ancient Lithuanian myths.
In conjunction with this song, we will ask Melbourne Georgian Choir to come back to perform Eastern Georgian mountain-style slow and gentle song called Tu Ase Turpa Ikavi, If You Were So Beautiful. If you were so beautiful, flower, why did I not notice you before? Because I have not yet opened my heart for love. Now I have found another gardener who takes care of me.
Sikava
Allow me to continue with story One Night in Ossetia. On Sunday, my father, pacing in the kitchen, dressed in his only suit, notices a taxi stopping under our windows and calls me to confirm whether it is Atsamaz. My breath rushes as I recognise him below. My tall father, hunching from his height, opens the door and shakes hands with Atsamaz. Atsamaz gives my mother a huge bunch of roses. She is wearing her best dress and her hair has been in curlers all night. Blushing, she goes looking for a vase while I usher our guest into the lounge room. With flowers sitting in the middle of the table, we share drinks and sweets. We suggest Atsamaz try a piece of shakotis, a tree-like cake with protruding tiny pyramids. My mother explains the reason shakotis looks bright yellow is that it's made of eggs, butter and cream, but also needs flour, sugar and is baked on a rotating spit. He's amazed by the horn-like pastry sticking out in all directions and the hole in the centre of the cake shaped like a well. He seems pleased that we purchased a medium-height shakotis in his honour and even more pleased to learn that such a treat is part of every traditional Lithuanian wedding. He giggles on discovering that the well is made for placing good wishes inside. He suggests we should think of some. We cut pieces of paper in different shapes to make sure each of us can reveal our wishes to the others and drop them inside the well. Eating and drinking some precious alcoholic beverages, we relax, except my father, who starts pacing up and down the room, fidgeting with his fingers, pressing down his hair to the right side of his worried face, buttoning and unbuttoning his jacket. Then he sits down to talk about his vegetable garden outside Vilnius and a shed built with his own hands on government land. Atsamaz asks whether our shed is similar to a dacha, and I agree, making an observation how, due to the size of our dacha, it's only suitable for keeping tools and work gear. My mother, sitting across the table, keeps pulling her loosened curls from her face. Now it's her turn to tell Atsamaz how much she loves the fruits of the forest and how she collects berries in summer and mushrooms during the autumn months. She's very keen to share her butter-fried boletus secret. We taste balandeli, cabbage rolls with hot potatoes. After lunch, we return to picking the horns of shakotis, taking folded pieces of paper out of the well. My father wants to own a car. My mother wishes all of us good health while I dream of travelling. Before unfolding his wish, Atsamaz stands up and, looking at both of my parents, says he wishes to marry me.
children choir sang Alilo, Hallelujah, Christmas song from West Georgia. On December 25th, Jesus was born. Oh, yes, very nice. I'd like to invite on stage an important witness of the 23rd August 1989 Homeland event, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the implementation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, known as the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The document, containing a secret protocol, allowed Russian occupation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Before we hear an abstract from my story, Dreaming of Sweden, I'd like to share the stage with the city section editor of the Herald Sun, John Pranauskas. John, we are two people of the similar age.
You're older.
Sorry. Born and bred as part of a different historical, political, and cultural discourses. Ignorant to politics, and also afraid I may not be able to come to Australia, because I came here in a great secret. Only my boss knew and my mama, because if I told anyone, I maybe never came out. Because in 1982, I was in Germany with a song and dance group, and I had money sewn into my skirt. And I told someone, and I didn't know until last year that he was a KGB agent. So I came back last year to see my mom, and my friend came around. She was from the same group. She was dancing, and I was a singer. And we looking through the photos, and she said, "Do you remember this guy?" I said, "Yeah, I told him about money in my skirt." She said, "You know what? After the trip to Germany in 1982, to East Germany, all of our group members, our group called the Sweetes, had a KGB file." So imagine me going and embracing hands with thousands, millions of people. So I was making a jam, ignorant to politics. I spent my 23rd of August, 89 in Palanga, a 15-minute walk to the beachfront where people actually was joining hands. Whereas my friend, John, traveled 15,178 kilometers to be a part of the Baltic Way. Could you please share some moments about this event with us?
Thanks, Grazina. I'll get onto the Baltic Way. I'll just sort of start with saying I visited Lithuania during Soviet times, so I know something about how people lived in that system. However, they were relatively brief visits, so I can't say I understood everything about the Soviet way of life. You'll have to read Grazina's book to get an idea of that. But I did get to witness the rebirth of the Lithuanian state as a journalist for the Age newspaper at the time, and as a casual contributor to ABC Radio National, the Europeans program, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. To say that it was amazing to be there is an understatement. I saw the beginnings of Sayudis, a movement mainly of intellectuals that grasped the opportunities of national self-awakening made possible by the reforms of Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. I interviewed many of the Sayudis leaders such as Vytautas Landsbergis and Arvydas Juozaitis, but also the communist leaders of Lithuania such as Algirdas Brazauskas, who was smart enough to know that change was happening and to react positively to it. What made the most impression on me were the mass rallies in Vilnius's Cathedral Square and Vingis Park, where hundreds of thousands of people protested peacefully, but with a stubborn insistence that Lithuania's voice must be heard. There followed the return of banned national symbols such as the anthem and the tricolour flag, which we saw here, of course, in our freedom, but over there were banned until the late 1980s. I must admit that as a young visitor going to Lithuania in the sort of 1970s and early 1980s, in those dark and dreary Soviet times, I never imagined it would be possible for such things to happen in my lifetime. Of course, the important event which has been alluded to was the 50th commemoration of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on the 23rd of August 1989. You've heard about it, so I won't go into detail again. I was lucky to be part of that incredible human chain, which later became known as the Baltic Way, stretching from Vilnius to the Estonian capital, Tallinn. It's hard to describe the feeling of unity and purpose when you are part of a protest along with millions of others, and the fate of 3 nations is at stake. The Baltic Way demonstrated to the world that while Soviet power still officially ruled Lithuania and the other Baltic states at the time, the game was really up, and it was only a matter of time before the countries would win back their independence. At the time, Vilnius was full of foreign correspondents, such as Rupert Cornwell, the renowned correspondent for Britain's independent newspaper, who also happened to be a brother of the famous spy novelist John le Carré. Le Carré's real name is David Cornwell. I'm proud to say that I played a small part in informing these reporters about Lithuania and the key political figures of the time. Perhaps my most cherished memory is the feeling of unity and happiness that gripped Lithuania during those heady days leading to independence. Unlike the bad old Soviet days, people were smiling in the street. They had a spring in their step. Strangers embraced in joy. Of course, that mood didn't last. How could it? But it was a pure representation of what happens when a nation and a culture is reborn, and I was privileged to be part of it. Thank you, and congratulations to Grazina on her fine book.
I'd like to read for you an excerpt from Dreaming of Sweden. Gitana surprised herself as she moved from being apolitical to attending more protests, reading the papers and listening to her friends. Lithuania was reviving its independence. People were protesting in Vilnius, Kaunas and Klaipėda against the Soviet totalitarian regime they had lived under for half a century. At the end of the month, hundreds of people gathered at the beachfront, joining thousands across Lithuania and 2 million others across the Baltic states, holding hands to make a 600-kilometre human chain in anticipation of regaining their independence. Mixing among the strangers, trampling the sand, Gitana tried to catch the unfamiliar words of the Lithuanian national anthem. She, like others, became emotional, shedding tears while listening to strangers, sharing their family deportation stories. She wanted to embrace them in the celebration of this Baltic Way. I myself met Grazina at the Victorian College of the Arts, where our friendship grew over a mutual love of the arts, and as a first-generation migrant myself, I was very interested in her experiences. So when she asked me to create an animation, I was intrigued by the prospect of delving into Soviet history. I watched documentaries and histories, and I realised that I wanted to combine animation with the footage that I was looking at. I was struck by the dissonance between the oppressive experience and the images of normal people going about their everyday lives. And I wanted to try to represent that in a video, which I'll get going shortly. The song that you'll hear is called A Thistle Grows in the Backyard, and it's a song about loss and family sung by an orphan.
Auga kiemeda gėlelė, kieme kiemelė, teta šedavarėlė, kieme kiemelė, teta šedavarėlė. Emere mona motinėlė, emere mona sena galvelė, palikau avėną, avėnas ratelė, palikau avėną. Ошнуеся он капели, ошнуеся он капели, и верик сё кокоесё, и гяко те заболеселю, и верик сё кокоесё, и гяко те заболеселю.
It took hours and hours for Liliana to create this animation, because how many hours takes 1 minute?
I couldn't say.
But like as 6 hours, 1 second animation. About
15 drawings a second.
15 drawings a second. And it's very powerful. It often stays in my mind because it's so simple. But the amber beads dispersing into people, it's a power. It's a real great power. And I'm afraid we have to stop. Because, time is ticking, and I'd like to thank very much every one of you attending today, to my speakers. They made a big impact on my book launch, a real punch from Enza, thank you very much, and Mark setting the background properly for people to listen like a history lesson. But it wasn't, because you already knew the history, most of you, and I learned while traveling through the pages of my book. So thank you very much, and many thanks to the Australian Lithuanian Foundation for financial support, also to the ex-president of the committee of the Melbourne Lithuanian community, Monica Mack, to helping me to organize this event, and Mantas Galvicius for technical and other assistance. And I'd like to see them if they're available on stage. Monica and Mantas. And invite, please, Mantas. Oh yes, they're both here. The rest of you have received the book beforehand, so just to shorten the ceremony today, thank you very much everyone for coming, and thank you for beautiful singers. I met them in 2010 first time. During the time when I was performing with a little group called something Surprise Tegmana. And at that very moment when I start singing, I thought, one day I'll write the book, and I'd like them to sing as part of my book, and my dream came true. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you. Thank you, Grazina, for this. It was wonderful. Where you put your wishes inside, and it came from a book, right? Just out of pages.